Does the Prime Minister understand? There is a growing feeling of anger in this country that we are living through two-tier policing and a two-tier justice system.
Of what the American administration believes is a fantasy. Joe Biden is going. In fact, many think he's gone. Already we will not stop the boats even if we send a handful to Rwanda. We will not stop the boats by attempting to smash the criminal gangs. We've been doing that to the drugs industry in Britain year after year, decade after decade with no success whatsoever. The financial rewards for smuggling people across the English Channel can now net a gang €2 to €3 million a week. I was half expecting to see on the immigration statistics when we see the back as speaker. So we absolutely endorse you in Irely for this job, and it is, I must say, in marked contrast to the little man that was there before you and BCH the office so dreadfully in doing his best to overturn the biggest democratic result in the history of the country. We support you, sir, fully. It's worth reminding ourselves that net migration was the same during the late 1940s, the whole of the 1950s, the whole of the 1960s, the whole of the 1970s, the whole of the 1980s, and the 1990s up until Mr. Blair. Net migration had run at 30 to 50,000 a year for over half a century. Then Mr. Blair gets in and decides we're going to open the doors in a way that had never been done before, to the delight and joy of big companies and especially giant multinationals who have always wanted as much cheap labor as they can get, and to hell with the consequences for working-class families and people. But perhaps it was even more of a surprise to see that massive acceleration in our population through immigration would then by a conservative party who, despite promises in 4 consecutive manifestos, actually accelerate what had happened under the years of Mr. Blair. And so we see a population increase of 10 million people since that time that Labour won its last landslide. Even the net figure is a migrant a minute. Even during the course of this debate, many hundreds more people will come to our country, and nobody is making the argument that there aren't some exceptionally wonderful people among them. There are, of course, but the sheer level of population means we have to build a new house every 2 minutes. Even if the Labour government is able to fulfill the 1.5 million houses that it wants to build during the lifetime of this parliament, it will make no dent at all on the current shortage of housing. Rents have risen by 25% since 2021. Why? Population increase and pressure, and the list goes on, through access to health services, to congestion, to pressure on infrastructure. The population crisis is the biggest impact affecting people's lives, damaging their quality of life, and virtually nobody in this place even wants to talk about it. But perhaps it's on illegal immigration that I do really want to make a point. For years ago, I went out into the English Channel repeatedly filming dinghies coming across the channel. Ding is with an average of 16 people per boat. I was described as being a sad, lonely, desperate figure always seeking attention, and I've no doubt there are some that think that's still the case today. On thank you, but I did it because it was obvious to me what was going to happen. It was obvious that there would be a huge influx of people illegally coming to Britain across the English Channel, and it would happen because we stopped deporting people who came to Britain illegally. And perhaps the Labour Party might want to reflect themselves on the last period of Labour government, where we had Home Secretaries like David Blancett far to the right of people like the Shadow Home Secretary today. You came to Britain illegally during the last Labour government. Your feet didn't touch the sides. You were gone. You were out. Indeed, in the last year of the Labour government from 2009 to 10, 50,000 people who came here illegally were deported. Now none of that happens anymore. It didn't happen under 14 years of conservatives, and it clearly isn't going to happen under this Labour government, and I wonder why. I think you'll find it's the increased rad of a court overseas that was set up in the wake of World War II with the very, very best of intentions that has now completely outlived its usefulness. It is, of course, called the ECR, the European Court of Human Rights, and it was the Labour government that enshrined the convention into British law. We will not stop the boats even if we sent a handful to Rwanda. We will not stop the boats by attempting to smash the criminal gangs. We've been doing that to the drugs industry in Britain year after year, decade after decade, with no success whatsoever. The financial rewards for smuggling people across the English Channel can now net a gang 2 to 3 million euro a week. Whatever prison sentences or penalties are put upon them, there will always be people volunteering to make millions of euros a week. We will only stop this if we start deporting people that come illegally. Then they won't pay the smugglers, but we'll only do that by leaving the ECR. But I've got a fun suggestion that I think would liven up politics, engage the public, and see a massively increased turnout. Why don't we have a referendum or whether we continue to be members of the EC? I have seen the effect of store birth in my own family, and yeah, it's pretty devastating. It doesn't go away, it doesn't get forgotten, but there's another element to this, which is for those people, particularly the women that go through this. Are they able to talk about it? Can they share their experiences? And a problem shared may not be a problem solved, but it might just make life a little bit more bearable, a little bit easier. I must be honest, when my niece had that still birth, I didn't feel I could face her and talk about it. I felt too awkward. Would I say something that was wrong? Was it best we just didn't discuss the subject? And a decade on, even though I'm close to her, I've never discussed it. I've just felt too awkward to do it, and I suspect that's the case with many men. I suspect with husbands and partners, just something that isn't talked about. And so I do want to pay tribute to Councillor Jeff Bray, from former leader of Tendering District Council, who has, you know, as a father that went through the still birth experience, talked about it. And I'm encouraged that in Clacton that Maria Gorley has got a charity where women and men, if they want to, can come together on a regular basis and share their experiences and talk about it. And it's not an easy thing to do, and I've admitted my own failings, but I suspect I'm far from alone in finding this subject just incredibly difficult. So I think the fact we're having this conversation, I think the fact, Lou, that anything that can be done to prevent avoidable disasters must be done. But I do just urge, I want to put on the record that naturally these things will happen, hopefully in very few numbers, and there does need to be the counseling and the support for people that have been through that experience, which I feel, to be honest, in most parts of the country is really very sadly lacking. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, that given the money we've given to the French, we no longer accept escorts from the French Navy. The day after 12 people died in the Channel, the day after there was a French naval vessel escorted a dinghy from a couple of 100 yards off Wyant all the way to our 12-mile line. No more French naval escorts, I think, is vital. So we need political will, and the Germans, of course, are now showing it. The Germans will ignore the ECR. The Germans will set a plane back full of young men to Afghanistan the other week. So with political will, with leaving the ECR, we can solve this. And I just promise the Labour government one thing: this issue caused great pain to the Conservative Party, and it impacted in the general election this issue of illegal migration and the crime that it leads to, which is a conversation that's barely started in this country, but a conversation but in France and Germany is now very big, will do massive damage to Labour's electoral chances. You're going to have to get tough, and I'm afraid your leader is going to have to rethink his position on the ECR. Thank you. Yesterday we witnessed some extraordinary celebratory scenes. Outside Britain's prisons where, in some cases, serious career criminals were released, and this to make way for rears, but equally those who've said unpleasant things on Facebook and elsewhere on social media. Does the Prime Minister understand? There is a growing feeling of anger in this country that we are living through two-tier policing and a two-tier justice system. I'm angry to be put in a position of having to release people should be in prison because the last government broke the prison system, and the Prime Minister was repeatedly warned he had his own release scheme. He was repeatedly warned that he had to adopt scheme that we put in place. The former Justice Minister said, if we don't do it, we'll have to get down on our knees and pray. The police chiefs made it absolutely clear in a letter to him before the election that he needed to take action, saying that they wouldn't be able to discharge their duties and saying the risk was loss of an ability to detain suspects. That means, Mr. Speaker, an inability to arrest people committing offenses. That's how bad it was, and they warned the leader of the opposition that further delays until after the general will increase the risk significantly. What did he do? He delayed and increased the risks. The judgment, the potential judgment, next judgment of a spurious, rather political foreign court matters more than the issue of national sovereignty. But and you boast that President Biden likes this deal now. The Speaker earlier on said that this House should not be affected by elections that take place in foreign countries. But I wonder, how confident are you if the 47th President of the USA becomes Donald Trump that he will approve of this deal given the importance of our relationship with America? Well, I'm grateful to the honorable gentleman for his question. Let me reassure him that we have sought to take views across the U.S. political establishment, but I do say to him to get a U.S. President, a U.S. Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Defense applaud this agreement should reassure him that the U.S. would do nothing that would help our enemies, particularly the Chinese, in this regard. Since the mistaken opening of negotiations by the last government on the sovereignty of the Chos Islands, it turns out the British High Commissioner and others appear to have been bugged by the government of Mayas. If the police investigation into this proves to be true, and we can see that Mayas, their government at least, are bad actors, in the light of that is the 99-year-old lease that you got on Diego Garcia even worth the paper that it's written on? Well, of course we note the reports with the significant concern, but the honorable gentleman would understand.
Well, of course, we note the reports with significant concern, but the honourable gentleman would understand that I'm not going to comment on an ongoing police investigation. As I pointed out yesterday, these obviously relate to historical conversations, not during the current round of negotiations, and we're absolutely confident that we've achieved a treaty that meets both our national security objectives, closes off a migration route, but also fundamentally respects the interests of Chagosian people.
People, but economically I sat listening to the numbers thinking this budget is illiterate. I don't know who's doing the sums, whether perhaps it's the right honorable member for Hackney North, but the sums do not work, and the markets now agree with me, because just in the last couple of hours we've seen a very substantial spike in gilt yields. We're not quite yet back to 2022 with that mini budget, but clearly people are saying this isn't going to work. And even more concerning, I suppose, is that the new head of the Office for Value for Money, David Goldstone, has served for many years on the board of HS2, which I would suggest is the very opposite of value for money. This point of order will be relevant. Can you confirm it's going to be relevant? I think it is relevant, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honorable gentleman mentioned the member for Hackney North. I just wonder whether he had warned her that he was going to be mentioning on the Chamber, I thank the honorable member for the point of order. However, that is not a point of order, it is a courtesy of the House. Nell, nice try, I was just gently teasing, that was all. Invest. Invest is what we heard at the start of this budget speak, and I thought, yes, that's what we need, absolutely not just the big multinationals that come to smart conferences, but equally, you know, hundreds of thousands of people putting their own risk capital into startups, into new businesses. But know this, invest is going to be done by the Chancellor on our behalf, not just a top economist at the Bank of England, but she's now going to be the fund manager of the nation, investing money and trying to pick winners. And I would suggest the last time governments attempted back in the 1970s to invest money and pick winners, it ended very badly indeed. I will give way. Thank the honorable gentleman for giving way, and I just questioned when he talks about investment in our country and in businesses, whether he prefer to have investment from our government or whether he'd prefer to have investment from maybe the Russian government. Maybe one or two members of the House ought simply to grow up, but there we are. It's a bit sad, and I've worked in private business myself, and I do wonder, I do think picking winners is wrong. I think we leave this to the free market and we let people either make money or we let them lose money. And frankly, you know, if they do, they're well, that's just the way these things work. Any business employing 5 or more people has today been hammered, and I make the point that I've set up companies and run companies. Nobody on the front bench has ever worked in private business. Nobody on the front bench understands what genuine risk capital is. Our business secretary, from what I can make out, has never even had a job. But the most dismal part, now I've had plenty of jobs, well, apart from being in the European Parliament, which doesn't really count, obviously, but I got to tell you what is dismal about this budget is the growth forecast. If the ambition of our Chancellor is that in 4 years, time growth should be 1.5%, that is very, very bad news for everybody, and particularly because it takes account of the rise in population that will happen through legal immigration. It basically means a rise of 0, and nobody's even mentioned today the fact that gross domestic product per capita, wealth per capita, has been falling consistently nearly every single quarter for the last 2 years. The bigger our population becomes, the poorer we are becoming, and that's a reality we got to wake up to. But I would say this, the big picture is we're in decline, we're getting poorer. There isn't a £22 billion black hole, that's nonsense. It's 2.7 trillion. Our debt repayments are 90 billion a year, and from all the figures I've seen today, that will be worse in 5 years' time than it is today. We need a complete change of culture. We need to start saying success is a good thing. Making money is a great thing. People becoming rich is something we should encourage. We got to change our culture of work. The idea that, oh yes, work from home, do a 4-day week, get your work-life balance right. Well, you know what, actually, why don't we say to people, young people, hard work is a good thing? Yeah, hard work is the only way anybody succeeds individually, and hard work is the only way we're going to have a chance as a country to turn any of this around. We're in much deeper trouble, a much more, and now you keep on going. Please sit down. Honestly, you've had Togo. We are in much deeper trouble than anybody on either front bench dares to admit. It's a reality we should all face. And I have to say that, for a Labour Party that couldn't define what a woman was, couldn't define what a working person was, well, after today, I'm pretty convinced they can't define what economic growth is. Thank you. I'm sure the Prime Minister and the whole House would wish to congratulate Donald Trump on his landslide victory last week. That the hold on, I will hear the question, how your thank you, but within a couple of days, we'd learned of a third assassination attempt. Charges have been laid, and behind it are Iran's re-evolutionary Guards has the time not come prime minister to prescribe what is so obviously a terrorist organization, and in doing so not just do the right thing but maybe mend some fences between this government and the incoming presidency of Donald Trump's, given that the whole of his cabinet have been so rude about him over the last few years. Well, I'm glad to see the oral member making a rare appearance back. Here in Britain we spent so much time in America recently. I was half expecting to see him on the immigration statistics when we see the next back, but he may have missed. I did congratulate the incoming president last week, and we will work with him. The point he makes about Iran is a very serious point, and we will work across the House and with our allies on it. Obviously, on question of prescription, we keep them under review. Thank you, Mar. ES has no legal or historical claim to the sovereignty of a group of islands that are 1,300 miles away from where it is, nor does from the International Court. It was purely an advisory opinion. There is no legal reason why we have to do any of this now. I warned the Foreign Secretary 6 weeks ago in this chamber that it was an enormous mistake to do this, given that we had a U.S. presidential election coming up on November the 5th, and if you say to me, well, yes, it's okay, the United States are fully in favor. Really, I can tell you that the incoming National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has form on this right back to when the Right Honorable Member for Braintree was doing his best to give away the sovereignty of the Joss Islands. Indeed, he wrote to Secretary of State Blinken at the time. There is out, I can assure you, having been in America last week, knowing also the incoming Defense Secretary very well, there is outright hostility to this deal. Whatever is said about a lease agreement, as we saw with Hong Kong, these agreements can very, very easily be broken. Diego Garcia was described to me by a senior Trump advisor as the most important island on the planet as far as America was concerned, so going to find outright hostility. And by the way, when it comes to the Georgian people, yes, of course, what happened to them was truly awful. They do not wish to live there. Unanimous in this, they do not wish to live under Marian rule. They want to live under British rule because they actually trust us. There is no basis for this agreement to continue with it is, and if you do, you'll be at conflict with a country without which we would be defenseless. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid, obviously, I fundamentally disagree with what the honorable gentleman has had to say. Let me be absolutely clear. This government inherited a situation where the long-term secure operation of this crucial military base, he is right on, that one point was under threat. International courts were reaching judgments. International organizations were taking steps not to undermine Marian sovereignty, and this threatened the secure and effective operation of the base, and in the absence of a negotiated solution, a legally binding decision against the UK seemed inevitable. This would have threatened the secure and effective operation of the base, and that was not sustainable. I note the comments he makes regarding the incoming US administration. We're looking very forward to working with them.
I welcome you back to the front bench, but I don't welcome you back to shout from it continuously. Do we understand that we need calm? This is an important debate, so I don't want the rhetoric coming from the Minister.
Not entered into any such arrangement in the first place. ODOD, Mr. França, I welcome you back to the front bench, but I don't welcome you back to SH from it continuously. Do we understand that we need Cal? This is an important debate, so I don't want the rhetoric coming from the Minister. Mr. Speaker, I've known the honorable gentleman a long time, and he knows he can come and speak to me at any point. No, absolutely, Mr. Speaker, but he can come and speak to me about these matters at any point. Mr. Speaker, we were very, very clear, the U.S. administration that's incoming, we will be working very closely. We're working closely with the current U.S. administration. This had support across the national security apparatus of the United States. We would never have entered into an arrangement, and indeed, of course, the previous government recognized the threats to the long-term operation of this base, which is why they started the negotiations in the first place. But it was this government that did the deal. Diego Garcia is absolutely important, but it is not at risk. It is more secure as a result of this deal. So what he is suggesting is simply not the case. He mentions the Shigashans. We all agree what happened to them in the P was completely wrong and shameful, and that's been agreed on all sides of the House. I've engaged with the chosen community on a number of occasions. He will also recognize, Mr. Speaker, that there are a range of views across the Josian community, including those who support this deal, but we've made sure that their interests are at the heart of this arrangement, whether it's in the trust fund, whether it's in the unilateral arrangements, that we will do the continued commitments to UK citizenship for Chians, and of course, their ability to return, Mr. Speaker, in terms of visits to all the islands and to part of the resettlement program that Marias will restart as a part of this treaty. So I am confident this deal is the right thing for our national security. It's the right thing for the Chosan community, and it's the right thing for our allies and partners. The presentation of what the American administration believes is a fantasy. Joe Biden is going. In fact, many think he's gone. Already I have been contacted by very senior officials and advisors from the incoming Republican administration, and every single one of them is appalled at this deal. They know the leasehold agreement will not survive, just as the deal with China over Hong Kong didn't survive. Hasn't the time come for the government to admit this is a rotten deal for the UK, a rotten deal for America, and an even worse deal for the Josian? And if you care so much about the sovereignty of the Falkland being in the hands of the Fawn Islanders, why not have a referendum of the Josian and ask them to settle who should have sovereignty over those islands?
Well, we are clear that net migration needs to come down after the huge increase. We also need to restore order to the asylum system. Part of that is going after the criminal gangs who are undermining border security and putting lives at risk and tackling the small boat crossings. But there is also an issue about the increases that we have seen around in-country asylum applications, and we have instigated a review into the increase in in-country asylum applications to get to the bottom of what is happening and why. There were two areas where we found that the previous government's decision to remove visa requirements for visitors had led to a significant increase in asylum applications for people who were coming as visitors. Instead, we have reversed those changes that were made by the previous Conservative government and reintroduced visitor visa requirements for those countries.
And yet, 69% of that 84,000 did not come across the English Channel votes. Can she tell me, please, where did they come from? Were they overstayers? Were they student visas? Who were the 69% secretary? From what? Well, we are clear that net migration needs to come down after the huge increase. We also need to restore order to the asylum system. Part of that is going after the criminal gangs who are undermining border security and putting lives at risk, and tackling the small boat crossings. But there is also an issue about the increases that we have seen around in-country asylum applications, and we have instigated a review into the increase in in-country asylum applications to get to the bottom of what is happening and why. There were two areas where we found that the previous government's decision to remove visa requirements for visitors had led to a significant increase in asylum applications for people who were Coming as visitors instead we have reversed those changes that were made by the previous conservative government and reintroduced visitor visa requirements for those countries. Well, Slinger, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've just returned hot foot from a very full Mar-a-Lago and I've spoken to several members, senior administrators, especially of the incoming administration who will be in the White